Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we will be discussing Governor Jay Inslee's final second-half budget proposal, a curious case of a high-profile resignation in Seattle, and just how golden of a parachute that official could walk away with. More citizen-led initiatives that voters could see on their ballot next year, and a rare call for more accountability in state and local spending on homelessness. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. Governor Jay Inslee this week unveiled his second-half budget supplemental for next year, which calls for an additional $2 billion in spending to the already $70 billion budget. The governor said at a news conference that, quote, "There are some numbers attached to it, but the numbers aren't important. What's important are the lives. There's a lot of lives that are going to be improved because of the proposals we are making." Joining me is numbers expert TJ Martinell. TJ, when you look at the rundown of the spending, what catches your eye?
I think that what really stands out is the $900 million for action on climate change, and which is a very significant amount of spending for a supplemental budget.
Now, as you said, much of this money is aimed at those environmental goals. Where exactly does that money come from? Is that general budget spending, or are we looking at a different location?
Yeah, what's interesting about it is it's coming from higher than expected revenue from the state's cap and trade carbon pricing program, which, if an initiative is approved by voters, would repeal that program. So he's proposing to spend a lot of money from a program that could get scrapped by voters next year.
Right. You're referring to the ballot initiative that could roll it back. Now, Republicans did respond to Inslee's plan. What did they say was missing in the total proposal?
They pretty much just said that what's missing is that there's no tax relief. A lot of states that have seen surplus revenue or collecting more than they are planning to spend, they've enacted tax relief. And this is among both Republicans and Democrats. Yet there's no proposal to enact any kind of tax relief, despite the fact that the state continues to receive more and more revenue every single year. Their spending has just increased consequentially.
Yeah, like you said, despite no income tax, Washingtonians do pay more than all but 13 other states and the District of Columbia in terms of state and local taxes. Tax Foundation, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, says Washington's 9.4% combined state and average local sales taxes are only higher in 3 other states nationwide. Thank you, TJ. Stick around. In Seattle we go to Spencer Pauly. We've got a curious case of a high-profile resignation. Sound Transit CEO Julie Tim has announced her departure this week from the agency only after 16 months in the role. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly joins us. Spencer, that's a pretty important job, right?
It's a huge role to play, being the CEO of Sound Transit. This is the agency which essentially is the biggest player in connecting the Puget Sound region. You have the agency's light rail system, which runs through Seattle, but expansions are underway to connect neighboring cities like Tacoma, Bellevue, and Redmond. So it's kind of the step forward to the future here in the Puget Sound.
Now, in her announcement, she said she's going to be formally leaving office in January. Did she give a reason for the sudden announcement?
She did. Tim announced her resignation in an email to employees, stating that was a family matter. More specifically, she's dealing with her ailing father over on the East Coast, and she's having trouble managing both being the CEO of Sound Transit and taking care of her father. I think she's choosing to go east instead.
No, it's an understandable situation. Obviously, family comes first and things like this as much as anything. Now, being, though, that this is a taxpayer-funded role, the public does have an interest in what she pulled in a year. How'd she do, Spencer?
Well, in the 16 months as CEO, Tim saw the Tacoma Link extension to the Hilltop neighborhood in Bellevue open, which was a big step for the expansion. And Sound Transit updated its fare compliance policy. Now, that's something I've covered before, where you have a lot of people kind of jumping the lines and just riding the transit for free, where recently it's stepped up its policies and you see more fare, quote unquote, fare ambassadors check and see if anyone has, proof of payment. There's also one instance where they set the single day boarding record with over 115,000 boardings in July. That was during the Seattle Mariners All-Star game. And then we also see some issues that Sound Transit had during her 16 months, including continued delayed projects, including the Seattle to Tacoma light rail extension. And Sound Transit struggles to still find a location for its eastward expansion, specifically in the Chinatown International District in Seattle. So there's a lot to handle there.
Yeah, and it's a long way up to climb from the basically grinding halt of the COVID-19 pandemic when nobody used public transportation more or less whatsoever, unless you were deemed by the governors of the respective states to be essential workers. Now, Spencer, many of these high-profile hires, I kind of look at them like football coaches, like in college football, where they get some sort of massive payout once they leave, either being the end of their contract if they leave before it's out, or they do tend to have some sort of like a severance package built into it. Oftentimes where you see the football coaches of D1 schools are the highest paid public employees in the state. Now, you analyzed her contract. What'd you find, Spencer?
Well, Tim's contract was intended to run through 2025, starting at a base salary of $375,000 with a minimum 3.5% annual increase. Now, she did have a severance package included with this, and that included severance pay equal to 1 year's base salary, being that $375,000, plus retirement benefits and health benefits. Now, I reached out to Sound Transit to confirm if she would be able to receive the severance pay. While I did not get a response at the time of the publication, I did receive one on December 14th. What they told me is to stick around for the meeting on Friday, December 15th, in which they will discuss the performance of a public employee, that being Tim. So we will see if they will determine if she's eligible for the severance pay.
Got it. Just to note, this is being recorded on Thursday, December 14th, for air over the weekend. But now, Spencer, I do understand the argument about needing to pay for high-profile talent. CEOs being educational and professional equivalent to some of the heads of these sprawling industry, public sector, city manager roles. But I wonder, though, where are the taxpayer protections in situations like this, where you have a city official spend just over a year in her office and then suddenly announce that she's going to head out and will leave office almost closer to 2 years, but still collecting an entire year of pay as she walks out the door, potentially, depending on this meeting. Spencer, have we seen any other high-profile resignations in the Seattle area lately similar to this?
We have. In fact, earlier this year, we had one, that being Mark Dones, who was formerly the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Now, Dones' role is important, if not more important, than a Sound Transit CEO role because of the homeless issue within King County and Seattle. Dones announced they were stepping down in May of 2023 after serving as CEO since just 2021. Now, Dones' reasoning being just burnout of the role and the position, seeing other people just get more and more frustrated with the workload and the lack of progress. And it was just enough for Dones to say, I'm done. That was just another instance that happened this year where we're seeing a tax-funded position just upping and resigning.
Right. And then you have all the payroll and the costs on the taxpayer dime to try and replace that person and get them oriented to the position and hope that they hit the ground running fairly quickly, because otherwise you're losing, an entire year of just trying to transition from one head coach to the other, and next your quarterback is useless.
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Spencer. To Tumwater we go, where voters' rights group Let's Go Washington has submitted signatures for now a couple of initiatives that could make their way to the 2024 ballot. On Tuesday, the group dropped off more than 420,000 signatures on what's referred to as the Parents' Bill of Rights. We've seen this in other states as well. TJ, this one has a lot of details to it. It's got a lot of tentacles. Could you give us a rundown of everything that, if successful, this ballot initiative would give Washington parents?
Yeah, so it gives parents and guardians, legal guardians, a right to review the child's educational materials, opt out of certain sexual health education programs, and receive certain types of notifications. And this is really around having parents be kept in the know about what's going on in the life of their children, because there's a lot of instances where parents are discovering their children are being taught things, they're being exposed to things that they don't approve of, and they're not being given any kind of notice in advance.
Now, this also stems back to situations we've seen controversial, school board meetings where parents come in and say that my fourth grader has been exposed. They're giving this book out in the library or as curriculum even sometimes that, I mean, even a upright thinking person can listen to this as they read them off in the meetings and say, is that not pornography? How much of this impetus for the Parents' Bill of Rights goes back to those local school district controversies, do you think?
Yeah, because the issue is what the school boards will allow in the schools. And incidentally, some people have actually been, I believe, arrested, not necessarily in Washington state, but in other states for reading some of this materials for the very grounds that you pointed out, that it being pornographic, which raises the question of why they're exposing it to children. But this would apply this policy at a statewide level. So instead of having to go from school board to school board to school board, you're going to just have it applied to the entire state.
Right. And we've seen some situations, too, where parents will come in and they will start reading those books that are issued to their kids in the school board meetings, and the officials will stop them because they will not allow that type of language they consider improper decorum at the school board meeting, which begs the question then, well, why on earth did you give it to my 9-year-old, right?
Well, and here's another question to consider. If it's inappropriate for it to be read aloud at a school board meeting, we could theoretically see a child get into legal trouble at school for reading it aloud to a classmate.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even really think about that.
You have minors involved in this. And it's the same thing where you have legal problems with underage children sending nude photographs of themselves on their cell phones to other minors. Very legally dicey situations. So that's part of that hasn't necessarily occurred yet, but that's just one thing that could go down the road if this issue isn't cleared up.
Well, and another part of this initiative also it goes back to what is referred to as Senate Bill 5599, which allows youth shelters, host homes, and state agencies to not inform estranged parents after they take a child in, a minor in, runaway youth is what they refer to it as, when also seeking abortions or irreversible gender surgeries. That also is part of this, where if I-2081 would become law via ballot initiative, because we assume that the state legislatures who would have been the ones to pass these laws that are at issue in the first place are not going to pass it and approve of it. If 2081 is successful at the ballot box, there would be protections in place for kids against that now Senate Bill 5599, correct?
Yeah, and the issue with that, if you, from I'd say a concerned parent or just somebody who's being a little looking at the implications of the bill, the question is who gets to decide whether they're a runaway youth and whether or not it was their idea to get all these irreversible procedures or whatever else that they are requesting, and it's the possibilities that they can be groomed to think like this or to believe this at school without their parents' notification. And some of these programs and materials could provide the context for those conversations. And so what this does, it allows parents to know that their children are being exposed to this kind of stuff and either opt out or keep an eye on their kids, because again, who gets to decide whether a child is a runaway or has been effectively kidnapped in a legal sense?
Right. Now, this group, Let's Go Washington, was back in Tumwater on Thursday, this time for a measure that would deal with the state's controversial police pursuit law. TJ, before we jump into what the initiative would do, could you give us some of the history behind that controversial law and the subsequent fallout?
Yeah, so prior to 2021, our state had a policy for police pursuits where you just need reasonable suspicion. So if you saw something going on or you saw someone fleeing a scene and it was reasonably suspicious that they were doing so, a police officer could pursue. In 2021, the state legislature enacted House Bill 1054, which changed that to probable cause. And what that effectively did is it meant that unless an officer directly witnessed a crime, they could not pursue a suspect who was fleeing a scene or anything like that. And it also prohibited most vehicle pursuits by police. Last year and this year, they've slowly made changes to these policies, but what's still in effect is a ban on vehicle pursuits for anything other than violent crimes.
Now, we've seen some criminals get smart to this law before. I remember one anecdote that we had read about this where the criminal addressed this law after being pursued by the police, correct?
Yeah, he called 911 and told them to tell the officers to back off and that it was illegal for them to be pursuing him.
That's incredible. If they're successful with this initiative, what exactly would it do? Is it just pure and simple, a rollback of this to pre-existing law that does not handcuff the police in regard to pursuing criminals?
Yeah, it would effectively roll everything back to what it was before 2021. And something to add, not only as far as existing policies, even when they're allowed to pursue, they have to go through a checklist of things that they must perform before. That includes getting authorization from their supervisors or superiors. And so instead of just being able to pursue at their own discretion based on reasonable suspicion, they have to, go through a checklist and bullet point of all these things, which can be difficult to do when seconds or moments count in making a decision about whether to pursue a suspect who, as we've seen in some of these cases, they flee the police and then later on get into an accident and end up killing somebody.
You mentioned that in Thursday's event, they had some supporters in attendance who had been personally affected by police being kept from chasing down suspected criminals. Tell us about who was there.
Among the people who was there was the mother of a 12-year-old girl who in January 2022 was hit and killed by a driver inside a stolen truck. And he was later found guilty of numerous felonies, including fleeing the scene of the accident in the stolen vehicle, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. What makes this very tragic, but also relevant, is that the guy who killed her, he had fled the police in a stolen vehicle several weeks before, and the police were not allowed to pursue. So from the mother's perspective, as she testified earlier this year on a bill in front of a House committee, she said that if the police had been allowed to pursue, they might have caught him, arrested him, jailed him, and he wouldn't have been on the road the day that he struck her daughter and killed her.
Unreal. And then the business that was there also, just as an aside too, had been vandalized multiple times and was had to be the business owner victim of a lot of these policies. TJ, in debate over the now controversial law back when this was still just a bill, supporters leaned on data showing that police chases had caused a lot of damage and others getting hurt. Now, you dug into this months back. You found some issues with that data, right?
Yeah, what I found when I talked to the Washington State Transportation Safety Commission, the statistics of the number of police involved vehicle fatalities is so inconsequential they don't even publish it on their database publicly. We're talking fewer than 30 people over several years. And meanwhile, we're at record levels of traffic fatalities for other things. So the argument that they're making that, and in most of these cases, it was the driver who was killed. So it was the driver who was fleeing a police officer that ended up crashing and being killed rather than pedestrians or innocent people, as some of the proponents would say. So it's very possible that more people have died. It would be very easy statistically for more people to have died as a result of the changes to the vehicle pursuit law than the number of people it saved.
Wow. All right, that's great. Thank you, TJ. Stay up on those initiatives at thecentersquare.com. Moving on to our next story, state and local officials in Washington have poured countless millions of dollars into staving off the state's homelessness crisis. Now, a state representative, Jenny Graham, a Spokane area Republican, says these well-intended but ineffective homeless aid programs have wasted taxpayer dollars. Joining me for this is Eastern Washington reporter Randy Brock. Randy, what is the representative looking to do with this?
What Representative Graham wants to do is introduce a bill that would require recipients of grant funding for homeless housing and assistance programs to provide annual plans revealing their goals and targets for next year. Graham didn't provide any a copy specifically of the measure, so it's not certain what exactly types of enforcement teeth it'll have in it. But in her press release, Graham said that her proposal would require grant recipients to show the number of people they expect to help out of homelessness, how much money per individual would be spent moving them into housing, and the length of time each individual remained housed at taxpayer expense. Graham said that the state auditor would be conducting annual performance audits of all homeless housing and assistance grant programs. And if any grantees are out of compliance, they would not be able to apply for future grants.
Oh, okay. So that's essentially the teeth of the bill. Okay. When you talk about just the amount of money that's been spent in the state, not only from state money, but also federal money brought down and funneled through these programs, but also municipally and county level, how much money do you have even an estimation of how much was spent on these efforts to reduce the number of homelessness that we see in our streets in Washington?
Well, I would cite the information from Washington's Office of Financial Management, and it says that the state has allocated more than $2.4 billion toward a wide range of efforts that are aimed at reducing homelessness and address a growing housing shortage through partnerships with local communities and organizations. Many of these programs are overseen by the State Department of Commerce, and they use state and federal funds for a number of services. Those can include street outreach, emergency shelter, services for homeless students, rental assistance, housing search and placements, and funding for landlords. Just to give you an idea maybe of the scale of it, in 2022, there was a statewide one-day point-in-time count that found that more than 25,400 people were living outside or in shelters across Washington. These counts are typically conducted annually in late January, and there's a new one scheduled in 2024, so we'll have some updated numbers then to kind of see what progress has been made.
Okay. Now, in terms of, looking at these agencies with greater scrutiny, typically you would assume that they would kind of shirk at the thought of having, regular audits and having to have more disclosure, even if it's for the good of the taxpayer. Now, you did speak to one of these, the heads of one of these organizations. Did she feel that way?
Yes, I reached out to Julie Garcia, who's the executive director of Jules Helping Hands, which is a nonprofit provider of homeless services in Spokane. She told the Center Square that Graham's proposal is a much-needed policy, and in Garcia's words, homeless funding needs an overhaul. So Garcia says that providers seek accountability from their clients, but accountability is not always required from the service providers themselves. It's also an issue that's been raised by the state auditor's office. Last November, the office issued a performance report saying that local government should be more data-driven and focused on results regarding homeless assistance programs. There's factors outside providers' control, such as housing shortages, that can affect their ability to hit these targets.
All right. Well, Washington lawmakers return to Olympia on January 8th, so we will be looking for Representative Graham's bill and more. So a big thank you to all of our journalists for sharing their stories. Now stay up to date with all of these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.